Okay, so now that we've had some time to take a look at the basic interface for Cinema 4D, we're going to talk about some of the basic conventions, how to stay oriented, and some of the basic tools for modifying, creating content in a 3D space. And so the first thing that we want to do is I want to point out a couple of different things with regard to our 3D space. I mentioned before that our 3D space is represented by the up axis, which is the y-axis. The red axis is our x-axis, and we can think of that as our left and right axis. And so typically, when I'm operating in a 3D space, unless I'm trying to get a different angle on an object, I tend to look down the z-axis or down the blue axis, with the blue axis pointing away. Now, once we start rotating objects, we're not necessarily relating to the direction of the object as it relates to space. We're thinking about the world space. So objects can point in different directions once we start rotating objects, but the world space becomes important, that we understand which direction we're facing in. Now, as I move this object, in this case this cube, around, you can see that if I look at its position coordinates, as I move it around, it's kind of floating in these three different coordinates in space. But the center of our 3D world is at 0 according to the x, y, and z. Okay, so if I, for some reason, want to get this object back towards the center of the world, which is a pretty good thing to do for us to stay oriented, because we generally want to model from the center of our world until we get used to the 3D space. What we can do is we can zero out the position. I'll highlight and zero the x, y, and z. So I'm focusing on the position column. I'm going to zero all of those out and hit the apply button. And when I do, that kind of snaps back to the center of my space. Okay. Now, if I'm kind of orbiting and panning around and I get a little disoriented and I kind of move away and I lose my object, what I can do is I can select an object in the object manager up here. Make sure that my mouse has focus in my perspective view, and I'll tap the S key. So S as in Sam. With an object selected, what that will do is that will cause the object to become framed. The selected object becomes framed in the view. And so if we get lost and get turned around, sometimes we can select an object, tap the S key, and then we still have to kind of orbit and look around. But it's not going to be unusual for us to be changing our perspective like this. Okay, so just kind of looking around, getting a sense of what my workspace looks like. Now, you'll also notice that I want to get rid of these two objects that I have inside my object manager, inside my perspective viewport. And there's a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can individually select an object. Right now I have the cube selected, and I can hit delete. Okay, I'll choose Command Z or Control Z to undo, or I can edit undo, which will bring that object back. Alternatively, what I can do is I can deselect, and I'll click and drag inside the object manager, and I can make sure that little selection covers both of those objects, and now they're both selected. So the object manager is a very powerful thing to stay organized within our scene, but also to select objects. You may have discovered that you can click on an object, and depending on what tool you have selected, you can highlight the object, but it's much more precise to select the object in the object manager. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my sphere that I've created earlier in the previous presentation. I'm going to hit the delete key, and I'll do the same thing with cube, and I'll delete that as well. Now, you'll notice that when I generate a new shape, let me just get rid of that cube. If I click one time on this primitive geometry cube, I get a cube. If I click and hold, I get this submenu, and this allows me to choose different kinds of geometry. Okay. Now, when I created that cube, by default, the position of that cube is at 0 along the x, 0 along the y, and 0 along the z, meaning that we generated this object at the center of our 3D space, or the origin of our world. Okay? So when I generate a second object, a sphere, It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little highlight around here. That sphere is roughly the size that fits inside the cube, because they default to about the same size. But they occupy the exact same space. They're occupying X, Y, Z set to 0. So their center points are aligned right on top of each other. I can use the object manager to select the different objects. And if I select the sphere and I roll my mouse over to the Y axis, if I click and drag, because I'm moving that only according to one axis, I know that it's perfectly aligned still with the Z and the X. So the only coordinate that I'm moving is the Y coordinate. And I can confirm that down here by looking at the position panel and moving this object up. And because it's still set to 0 along X and 0 along Z, as I orbit around this object, you can see that the sphere is essentially aligned and perfectly stacked with that cube, and that assumes that I haven't moved the cubes. The cube's still set to 0, 0, 0. So mathematically, we can kind of make some sense of our environment, and if we do inadvertently move something in space, okay, and I inadvertently kind of move some things around, I could go back and say, well, I really want these things kind of aligned in this space, and I inadvertently move this along X. I can always go back and then zero out the X position. And I can do the same thing with the cube. I could just take a look here and say, do I really want this to be have a positive value in the Z space? And I don't, so I could zero that value out. Sometimes it's just easier. I'll delete this object. To delete an object that gets out of control and recreate a new object, it'll default to the center of the world space. So it's really, really important that we're only moving axes or moving objects according to one axis at a time. So I'm moving it in the Z space right now. And as I send it in the direction of the arrow, regardless of what axis, that's the positive direction. So we're adding to the value of Z. And as I drag it backwards, you can see that's moving into the negative value. So we're positive and negative, okay, relative to our starting position. So I'll just zero that back out. So that's kind of how the math is working out in this space. And we can be more intuitive about it and just, kind of move things around visually, but it's important that we can get these things to line up and stay centered depending on the kind of object that we're building. So for example, if I'm trying to build an object that requires this sphere to be sitting on top of the cube, it may be that if I just click and grab this sphere without restricting its motion to one axis, if I just click on this object and drag it. Now notice what's happening in my position coordinates. I'm going to Command Z to undo. Watch what happens to my position coordinates down here when I don't restrict the motion according to one axis. So I'm rolling my mouse over, I'm avoiding these axes. If I click on this sphere, no matter how steady my hand is, no matter how good that motion looks, it looks pretty good. I just moved this up, but you'll notice that all three coordinates changed. That object kind of floated in space as I'm moving it around. Okay, and it looks okay from this view, but as I start to orbit around, you can see that things start to fall. According to this perspective, it looks okay. It looks kind of centered. But when I move around, you can see that things start to fall apart. Okay, so it's really, really important that we're not just kind of taking this object and moving it and saying, okay, I want this kind of over here, and that looks pretty good. And I'm just dragging these objects, and now I'll create a new cone, and I'll take this cone, and hopefully I can sneak in here and grab it and try to, place that on as a hat. And I can see, well, that doesn't appear to be lining up because I'm looking at these highlights here. Well, it's because I'm moving it kind of all over the place. I moved it according to three axes by not restricting its motion. And though it may look kind of good, more or less lined up in my perspective view, as I start to move around, you can see that those objects are all floating in space. Okay, so I could zero out the X and the Z. I want Y to be different because Y is the vertical axis here, and if I'm trying to stack these objects on top of themselves, I'll just hit apply, move that object up. I could do the same thing with the sphere, just zero out the X and the Z, hit apply. And so I'm just kind of centering those things back into the world. So this is something that we need to be mindful of. So let's take some time, create a couple of different objects and stack them on top of each other in the vertical or the Y space, being mindful all the while that the blue axis, when you're not just kind of looking around your object, when you're done, come back and kind of send the blue arrow pointing away from the camera. So we're looking at the top-down view is vertical, and the left-right view axis, the red axis, is more or less pointing left and right. And then we'll talk about modifying these objects, rotating them in space and scaling them and changing them in different ways. But we'll do that in the next presentation.